Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. It's amazing to see a lot of familiar faces, and I'm also happy to see some new faces. This summer has just been a tremendous experience for me, and I first want to thank you all for welcoming me into your community. This is really my dive into the professional world. After I graduate in December, I'm going to be looking for a job, and what a wonderful place to start with this experience. So thank you. As Dan was talking about, I did the Greensboro Bend Place Project. And what does PLACE stand for? I'm going to tell you. Landscape analysis and community engagement, place-based. Okay, so that's what it stands for, and those elements were integrated throughout my project this summer. And this photograph is right out the back door of the train station, looking up and down the Lamoille River. So when ecologists think about the land, we break it into what's called the layer cake. Okay, so you can imagine the most delicious cake, vanilla, chocolate, layers, layers, layers. And at the bottom of that layer cake is the bedrock geology of a place. And on top of that, we think about surficial sediments and soil. And what I mean by surficial sediments is what the glacier left behind, okay? It's glacial deposits. And then both of these things inform the hydrology, and of course the suite of plants, okay? So we're moving up through this layer cake, and our wildlife as well, which is kind of perfect because this space is going to be holding the game supper in the next 3 weekends. So, wildlife is really, really important, both ecologically and culturally. And last but not least, all of us. Right? So when we tell a story about a place, we tell it through this layer cake approach. So let's dive into this layer cake and start with the bedrock geology. So what's really neat about Greensboro is that it's part of what's called the Waits River Formation. Sounds a little fancy, but I'm going to break it down for you. So this light blue, here's Greensboro, this square, and the light blue is the Waits River Formation. And what's neat about it is that it extends north to south throughout Vermont. So this light blue here is all the Waits River Formation from Canada down to Massachusetts. And it really has limestone origins. And geologists actually think that the shoreline of the Iapetus Ocean, which precluded or pre-existed the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so this is a vast, vast ocean that came before the Atlantic Ocean, and this is the shoreline. Okay, so what's in this ocean? Creatures that have calcium in them, all right? So when these bodies decompose, all right, this becomes a part of our bedrock over time through heat and compression, right? So when you have a bedrock that's full of limestone that actually came from creatures in the sea, all right? So that's really neat about this area. Okay, so we have that first layer, right, the bedrock geology. And on top of that, the next layer is the superficial geology, okay? So this is what's left behind from the glaciers, and most recently, the latest glaciation, the Laurentide ice sheet, which receded around 13,000 years ago, 13,500 years ago, left behind a whole assortment of deposits, okay? And in this map, pink is dominating, and pink is till, all right? And it's really a combination of different sediment sizes. There's sand in there, there's clay in there, there's gravel, boulders, all sorts of mixed sediment sizes that aren't in any layer. And then if we focus in on Greensboro Bend down here, you can see that those colors change. So we've got a moraine and alluvium. The alluvium is really just a result of a river coming through, okay, and deposits left by that. And the moraine is kind of a buildup of that till. And a depiction of what this looks like. This is a photo from Greensboro Bend itself. So you can kind of imagine, and for scale, look at these trees. So we've gone through the first two layers, right? We've got the bedrock geology, we have the superficial geology, and now we're going into the hydrology. And Greensboro Bend and Greensboro has this really wonderful thing going for it, which is that the Lamoille River headwaters are really, really close. So in this photograph, we've got Caspian Lake, just to orient you a little bit. And then up here, this little blob, and I'll show you a better photograph, is Horse Pond, okay? And the headwaters, I would say officially, from what I've read, are in Wheelock, but really, it's a shared space between Greensboro and Wheelock, okay? And then the Lamoille bumps over and down along the border here into Greensboro Bend, okay? And so in context over here, we've got the Lamoille River watershed. And this section is the furthest to the east, right? And so this river is 85 miles long, right? Headwaters in Wheelock and Greensboro. And then it drains into Mallett's Bay, which is in Colchester over here. And it drains 706 square miles. So when you think about this place in context, not only does it impact, does the health of the river impact this community, but it also impacts the entire watershed. And then to zoom out, actually first, beautiful Horse Pond. And then to zoom out, the watershed is broken into three sections. Okay, the upper, the middle, and the lower. And you all are in this section right here. And then, what basin are we in? The Lake Champlain Basin, all right? So this watershed is the yellow in that image. And part of Greensboro actually drains into another basin as well, the Lake Memphremagog Basin. So two basins are impacting Greensboro. So now we've got the watershed context. We're moving through that layer cake. And I'm biased. My favorite thing to think about is plants. So I'm going to put these plants into context for you a little bit. And what's important to understand about the northern Vermont Piedmont, and as Clive taught me, it actually is pronounced Piedmont, so foot of the mountains. And that's because we're at the foot of the Green Mountains. If I were to define this area, I would, and I think you all would say this too, it's a very hilly region, and it's got a lot of rivers running through it. So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is that it's a moderate place. And by that, I'm thinking about the climate, right? And so it's cooler and moister than the Champlain Valley, where I'm from, which is this section. And it's warmer and drier than the northern Green Mountains, which is this section. And also it's warmer and drier than the northern highlands, okay? So you're right there where that yellow star is, okay? So we're starting to create a little context for the plants to come. And the way that ecologists in my program think about plants is we group them into communities. And so I'm going to cover two communities during this talk, but there are multiple other communities in Greensboro Bend. The first is the lowland spruce fir forest. And as you can see in its name, it is really comprised of two dominant species, spruce, usually red spruce, but it also has black and white spruce in there as well, and fir, okay, balsam fir. And for those of you that went on the field walk, you may remember this tidbit, but the way that I like to distinguish them in the field is by actually feeling the needles. And so if you run your hand along a spruce, it will feel spiky. And so I kind of remember that with some alliteration, spiky spruce. Let's all say that. Spiky spruce, okay? And so you can imagine kind of little pins on your hand. And then for fir, we have one for that as well, okay? Friendly fir and beautiful. Okay, so spiky spruce, friendly fir. And these trees really do define a huge section of not only Greensboro Bend, but also Greensboro. And I wanted to mention some other trees as well. Up here we have the northern white cedar. In the middle we have tamarack, which is turning this beautiful yellow right now. So a lot of the yellows that you're seeing across the landscape are this wonderful tree. And then red maple as well. So we were talking about trees, our woody species, right? But we also think about these communities in terms of the herbaceous species, so the non-woody species. One of my favorites is bunchberry here. Another is Canada Mayflower, this top image. And then pink lady slipper, very showy. And intermediate wood fern. And I understand that, there are a lot of names here, and I wouldn't worry about necessarily memorizing the names, but more just understanding that certain groups of plants live together based off of that layer cake that I was talking about, the bedrock geology, the superficial geology, the hydrology, and the climate of a place, okay? Now we're gonna move into that second community. Another favorite, and this was brand new to me because it's unique to the northern part of Vermont. And so a lot of the floodplain communities that I've thought about are in the Champlain Valley in a warmer area. So you've got a really special community of plants here. And we also learned this one on the field walk. It's okay if you don't remember, we are going to go over it. It's a black ash, okay? And what's cool about the black ash is that it really replaces what would be here in southern parts of Vermont, so the green ash. So as you move north, the black ash are swapping out for the green ash. Okay, so one way to tell a black ash is that these leaflets, so this whole thing is a leaf, and these are the leaflets, and the little stalk, okay, is non-existent. In a green ash, there would be a stalk there. And in this plant, in this leaf, there wouldn't be, okay? Does that make sense? So a little stalk is not existent in the black ash. Another way to tell is if you wrap your hands around that trunk, it would be really spongy. Some other species that are unique to this community are the gray birch, speckled alder, which you all have a ton of, just a ton of speckled alder along the Moyle River, and the beaked hazelnut. And it's hard to see here, but it's actually like a little beak, the fruit is. So those are some of the species that you would see right along the Moyle River and the surrounding floodplains. And it's a really, really special type of community. And then some of the herbaceous species that you would see there are sensitive fern, which is very wavy and flowy. And then the ostrich fern, which you can see. So these are the fertile fronds here. They reproduce with spores, and they kind of look like an ostrich feather. And the other common name for it is actually fiddlehead fern. So these are the ferns that you can forage for. And I wanted to talk about one really special plant, and I'm not going to even name it just yet. I was wandering through a property in Greensboro Bend and said, holy smokes, what is this thing? I've never seen it before. And it's an orchid, and it's enormous. Okay, so to put this into perspective, my field notebook here is 6 inches, and if you kind of stack it, right, it's about 2 feet tall, which is very big for an orchid. And for more reference, this is my index finger, right? So it's quite thick as well. So as you're walking through the forest, you can imagine, you know, a pretty tall orchid. And what's cool about this is that it lives in a very specific environment. Okay, so it likes seeps, it likes water, groundwater seeping through, and it really likes limestone. Ah, well that makes sense because we've got bedrock limestone, right? And it kind of likes disturbed areas as well, and there has been some cutting in this area. So it's kind of like this perfect, unique environment for this orchid. And in the field of Ecology, we rank these species in terms of their rarity. So an S5 would be, oh, I see it everywhere, and an S1 would be very, very rare. And this one's an S3, and that's pretty exciting. Like, hey, we've got an S3 species, let's think about why it's here and how we can promote it continuing to be here. So I just wanted to point that out because it was a really, really fun discovery. So now we've gone through another layer in the layer cake, and lo and behold, the most beautiful fish in Vermont, in my opinion. So this is the picture of a brook trout, and now we're thinking about wildlife, right? And brook trout are doing well in the Lamoille River, which is exciting. And hey, let's continue to do that work, but also make sure that they survive into the future. And some of the things that they like, okay, are pretty cold water temperatures. They like rocky stream bottoms, and they like stable banks, okay, with a lot of plant growth on them. So, yeah, let's just think about these notes, and I'll refer back to them later on in the presentation. An important thing to know, in case you didn't already know, is that the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department actually manages a section of the Lamoille River and also Greensboro Brook for the purpose of recreation. So I got on the phone, and the gentleman that covers this section of the river, Will, said, yeah, we manage this solely so people can fish on it. And Dan, as you were mentioning earlier, the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail is going to come through there. And hey, isn't that a great opportunity potentially to kind of highlight that area as, hey, you know, folks can stop and fish here. So I'm just pointing that out now, and think that they could potentially be a really good partner as Greensboro Bend, you know, thinks about the river and its relationship with the rail trail moving forward. It was a really great year for the monarchs, and I had the pleasure of watching many of them be raised at Green Mountain Monastery. Ami did just a beautiful job. And so, you know, these monarchs, they stop over here in Greensboro Bend, and it's kind of a unique species in that it has this global impact, or, you know, an international impact. So they're actually migrating down to Mexico. And so what a wonderful opportunity to make sure that they have plants, their favorite plant, common milkweed down here, and here this monarch is nectaring on Joe Pyeweed. So to just think about those plants in relationship to wildlife, and in particular the monarch. And this is a picture of the monarch's landing down in Mexico. So, and this is right along the rail trail. And then, of course, our birds. So these 5 birds are important because they've been highlighted by the Audubon as birds of conservation need. And I will reveal their names now. So the black-throated green warbler, the chestnut-sided warbler, the veery, the white-throated sparrow, and the wood thrush. And there's an opportunity here to really think about birds not only as important ecologically and supporting their habitat, but how that can happen in partnership with timbering. So those two things can really happen together, and there are resources, it's called Foresters for the Birds, where folks can kind of dive further in and figure out how they can manage their land to support these birds at the same time. And again, I either saw or heard these birds in the spring and summer. And then our favorite as Vermonters, of course, the white-tailed deer. And something that's really special about Greensboro Bend is that it's got a deer wintering ground in it. And so that spruce fir forest that I was talking about in the northeast component or area of the Bend, so to put it into context, This is kind of Howard Silver's farm down here. This area is really important for maintaining habitat for white-tailed deer. And so thinking about the management of these various properties in order to sustain the populations of white-tailed deer now and into the future. And then let's think about wildlife in terms of connectivity. So this is a map that's done by Vermont Conservation Design, which is really focusing on making sure that blocks of habitat are connected now and into the future. And so this is a map of connectivity blocks, and red would be a 0, meaning like not so important for connectivity, and the darker green would be very, very important. And so this area right here is kind of like a 7 or 8, all right, in terms of importance. And then zooming out a little bit, let's see if I can, gosh, it's hard for me to even see Greensboro here. It's right there, okay? So I'm showing you this to just kind of think about connectivity for wildlife in a larger context, and that things that happen in Greensboro impact movement of wildlife elsewhere too. And not only for white-tailed deer, but for other species as well. Whether it's a black bear or a shrew or, pick your favorite kind of animal and then think about it in the context of local and regional. So now we've kind of gone through many, many layers of the layer cake, all right? And none of the landscape exists without the influence of humans, right? And it was such a tremendous opportunity this summer to do a lot of community engagement throughout Greensboro Bend. And so, of course, the Bend Block Party was just a phenomenal experience, and it really brought folks together. And the reason that I mention this is that it's like, wait, what does the landscape and ecology have to do with people? And I think they have everything to do with one another, and that one can't really exist without the other. And to have community events outside around food and socializing are really important to the landscape. So I would recommend continuing to do these sorts of community gatherings that really bring folks together. And another event was the Stories of the Bend. And it was this tremendous experience where we were sitting in our community park, and folks were referencing the landscape. They were pointing up and down Main Street and telling stories both from the past and present. And I think those stories, that kind of oral tradition, really helps to tie the landscape together, whether it is referring to the natural or cultural world, or sometimes both. Actually, can we have the storytellers raise their hands, those that are here, just for fun? Thank you so much. And another opportunity to think about human impact on the landscape is through our buildings, right? And to really think about the buildings in a historic context. And so Sam Ford, who graduated from the Historic Preservation Program at UVM, came and did a walk, really diving into the architectural details and history of various buildings on Main Street. And there's actually a PDF on the back table, and it will be available online as well, where you can read through the different elements of our walk. And then, of course, the native plants in Greensboro Bend Field Walk, because plants are my favorite thing. And also, I should mention that the reason that these, for those of you who weren't at the Bend Block Party, we voted on different categories for field walks, and that's kind of how these arose. So the native plants in Greensboro Bend Field Walk was an absolute blast. Even though it was a rainy day, we still had some enthusiastic folks out there. And so the reason I mention this event too is it's just another way to kind of interact with the environment, to learn about it. So I also had this great opportunity with Deanne, kind of leading the way on it, to offer some suggestions for conservation recommendations because the town plan is currently being redone. And so after many public conversations, a lot of them happening at the Revitalization Initiative meetings, and also through private conversations, through community interviews, one-on-one interviews with folks, I kind of broke these conservation recommendations into 3 main categories. And the first is street beautification. And not only is street beautification aesthetically pleasing, but it also is an opportunity to influence the ecology of a place. Okay, so this is a picture of Main Street. And, you know, for example, let's just imagine American elm lining these streets, or red maple, or, you know, choose any kind of suite of native trees, some of which you've heard about today, and think about those lining the street. So I definitely see it as an opportunity for Greensboro Bend in the future. The second theme is healthy rivers, and in this situation I'm certainly referring to the Lamoille River. And one area of focus for the river, which I already referred to, is to benefit the brook trout, right? And a way that we can do that is to plant buffers. And what is a buffer? Well, it's a vegetated area next to a stream or a wetland or a lake. And in some areas of the river, the buffer is awesome, okay? Like part of David Ducharme's property, all along the river, on the bank, the shrubs and trees are maintained there. And that has a really positive impact on the ecology of the river, okay? So it keeps that river healthy. It keeps those banks intact. Think about Hurricane Irene. I know that it didn't flood all of Greensboro Bend. It certainly did further down by Howard Silver's farm and where Standard Brook comes in. So to just think about, you know, as climate change impacts our landscape more and more, how vegetated buffers would be a great benefit to the community. So that's another recommendation. And remember, these are all recommendations and opportunities, but it's entirely up to you all to think about if you want to integrate them or not. And then last, but of course not least, forests and farms. So we've spoken about kind of 2 communities that are really important, that spruce fir lowland and the floodplain forest along the river. And then of course also, in I would say 13 out of the 15 interviews, folks mentioned the importance of the farm in southern Greensboro Bend. And so to really think about how we can maintain the farm, but also keep the health of the river in mind at the same time. There's no reason why those 2 things can't coexist. And I'm going to write a more in-depth. Right now I just have a summary of these recommendations that will be in the town plan directly, and then there will be an appendix with a list of resources, in-depth resources for each of these summary sections that you'll be able to refer to. Just to let you know what's coming next, so I'm currently writing up a town analysis report which really goes through that layer cake in great detail, and so that will be available hard copy but also online, so you can refer back to it in the future. And then the full conservation recommendations report, and then the Stories of the Bend edited footage. And I think that will be on the Greensboro Historical Society's website on the video archives. And then I just wanted to bring your attention to a few resources in the back there, including the write-up that Sam and I did of the Historic Preservation Walk. If you are a waterfront landowner, so that could be a stream, a lake, or a wetland, there's a really wonderful resource over there as well. And then if you want to have a sense of the terrestrial invasive plants of Vermont, there's a handout for that. So thank you all so much for coming, and I know this is a long list, and I feel like there's never a right way to do the thank you screen, but so many of you have been integral to my study this summer, and I appreciate your support and your enthusiasm, and yes, thank you for your time, and if you have questions, I am happy to answer them.